During years of bleak snowpack, meager stream flow, and shrinking reservoirs, it's hard to imagine that dry lake beds and dormant spillways would once again be filled with water. Water that is critical to California's growing population, economy, and environment. Since droughts are as unpredictable as wet years, Californians must continue to prepare for the possibility of more drought. Because rainfall in California can be erratic, it should be no surprise that the longest sustained drought in recent history was preceded by a record flood. Who would have predicted that the flood conditions that plagued Northern California during February of 1986 would quickly give way to severe drought? As floodwaters filled reservoirs to their brim, a long dry spell was on the horizon. In the winter of 1986-87, a high-pressure weather pattern began to settle over the state, pushing major winter storms around California, and so the drought began. Trees, plants, fish, and wildlife were the first to feel the effects of the drought, as Northern California's watershed received little precipitation. As drought became reality, many urban water agencies began activating conservation and rationing programs. Farmers began reducing their surface water use and pumping more groundwater. Most institutions, commercial businesses, and manufacturers became more water conscious and modified their operations to use less water. At home, Californians pitched in and helped reduce water consumption. As conservation efforts increased, stored reserves in both surface and groundwater supplies, including the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, were able to meet water deliveries for the first 3.5 years of the drought, with no cutbacks from major water projects and little economic impact. Californians were benefiting from the foresight of public and private agencies to construct water storage and transfer facilities. These facilities were successfully protecting the state from devastating hardships of drought. Severe local water shortages did occur in some areas, such as Santa Barbara, because their water systems are isolated from major water projects. The severity of Santa Barbara's water shortages prompted the city to construct a seawater desalinization plant. Although desalinization is costly, it can provide a reliable alternative water source. Going into the 4th year of drought, water shortages resulted in a cut of up to 50% to agriculture from the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. Despite the shortages, farmers were able to maintain production and protect permanent crops by pumping more groundwater. Most urban water suppliers continued voluntary or mandatory rationing, which reduced domestic and industrial water use. The 5th dry year, 1991, proved to be the driest since the 1976-77 drought. Serious economic impacts were finally felt, with the State Water Project having to make severe cutbacks to urban water agencies and completely eliminating deliveries to agriculture. The Central Valley Project had to cut deliveries to agriculture as much as 75%. Fortunately, surplus water from the Colorado River helped lessen the impact in Southern California.
We will obviously continue to work with the federal government,
to minimize the economic and environmental consequences of the drought, Governor Pete Wilson selected a drought action team, which recommended an emergency plan in February of 1991. One highlight of the plan was the development of the Emergency Drought Water Bank, to be operated by the California Department of Water Resources. The water bank produced voluntary water transfers between willing buyers and sellers to help relieve water shortages. farmers found they could sell their water to the bank without fear of losing their water rights. From the beginning, the water bank was successful. The Department of Water Resources was able to buy several times the amount of water that was expected. Water transfers did create some third-party impacts to local economies. Several farm-related industries lost revenue as farmland was fallowed and its water sold. In 1992, reduced demands allowed the department to avoid purchasing water from farmers that would result in fallowed land, so local economies were not adversely affected. The sixth year of drought brought an unusual distribution of rain and snow to California. Northern California, which normally receives most of the precipitation, received very little, and Southern California and the South Coast had an unusually wet winter. Although this rainfall increased storage in groundwater basins and filled empty reservoirs near Santa Barbara, key state and federal project reservoirs in the north still remained dangerously low.
It's April 30th, 1992, the Phillips Ranch snow course. And in this meadow here, we should have about 3 feet of snow representing 16 inches of water content. Today it's 0. There is no snow. Meadow's dry. It's probably been dry for a couple of weeks. This really doesn't bode very well for continued runoff on into the spring and the American River watershed. It means the river has already peaked probably 2 to 4 weeks early, so the level in the reservoirs will start to go down instead of increasing on into June.
After 6 long, dry years, reservoir levels in Northern California were lower than any other time during the drought. To cope with dwindling water supplies, Californians continued conserving water. Farmers stretched available water supplies through drip irrigation, irrigation system management, laser leveling of fields before planting, and ultimately planting less acreage. As surface water became unavailable or unaffordable, farmers became more dependent on groundwater for survival. This resulted in overdraft of groundwater basins, especially in areas south of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. In cities, water districts encouraged water conservation through mandatory and voluntary programs. These included the installation of low-flow fixtures and toilets, and the planting of drought-tolerant landscapes. Other methods of coping with water shortages included rationing, recycling wastewater, and trading and sharing water supplies. As Californians worked together to stretch their water supply, all looked forward to the return of wet weather. But after a dry November in the fall of 1992, things looked pretty bleak as Northern California headed for a 7th year of sustained drought. For the first time in state water project history, the Department of Water Resources announced that urban water agencies and farmers could expect to receive only 10% of their normal deliveries in the coming season. Finally, in December of 1992, the storm door opened and Northern California began receiving above normal amounts of rain and snow.
Right, next. 8679. 33 inches of water.
We did have an excellent December. At many of our courses, we had, for January 1st measurements, easily double the normal January water content.
Although the wet weather was encouraging, each winter month would have to deliver above normal precipitation to end the drought. Fortunately, the storms continued through the winter of 1993 and dumped more snow in the Sierra Mountains than had been seen in a decade. The drought was over. Northern reservoirs that were at critically low levels began to fill with runoff from above normal amounts of rain and melting snow. The question that still lingers is, Will future years bring normal amounts of rain and snow? Only time will tell. The experience of this drought has shown the necessity of preparing to cope with future water shortages, and there will be future water shortages. The droughts of 1929 through 1934 and 1976-77, along with evidence contained in tree ring studies that document tree growth, confirm that droughts are part of California's climate history. Future water shortages will not only be the result of dry times, but will also be the result of California's growing population and its commitment to the environment. As population and water demands grow, California will be more susceptible to the effects of drought. There is also the possibility that future water shortages may even occur in normal years. Urban growth will intensify water shortages, especially during dry times. Creative solutions to California's water problems are not only possible, but necessary. Successful water management needs to provide a safe, reliable urban water supply to meet the needs of domestic, municipal, and industrial uses. There must be an adequate water supply at a reasonable cost to agriculture. Agriculture is critical to California's well-being. It provides food and fiber for our growing population and provides over $18 billion in direct receipts, and billions more in related industries that supply 50% of the nation's fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Water also needs to be reserved for the restoration and protection of our precious fish and wildlife habitat and endangered species. And water must be available to repel saltwater intrusion in the Delta. With normal reserves, a drought of 2 to 3 years can be successfully managed. But longer droughts, coupled with population growth and increased water requirements for the environment, will not be manageable with today's systems. Californians must continue to have the foresight to develop new water sources, along with making the most of our existing water supplies. But first, attention has to be given to the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The State Water Project and the Federal Central Valley Project export water through Delta channels. Transferring large amounts of water through Delta waterways without making improvements has had adverse impacts on its fisheries and wildlife. As a consequence, conditions in the Delta have gotten worse, especially during the drought. In order to meet all our present and future water needs, Californians must work together in making the necessary preparations. These include fixing the Delta, developing new water sources, increasing water conservation, expanding water recycling programs, and recharging groundwater basins during wet times. The conjunctive use of available water also needs to be encouraged. In conjunctive use, surface water and groundwater are managed together to conserve and make the best use of all available supplies. During wet times, available surface water is used instead of groundwater. This allows groundwater levels to rise. And during dry times, when less surface water is available, groundwater will be available to help meet critical water needs. Water systems must also be linked to allow agencies to share, trade, or exchange water. Californians have done an exceptional job of managing and conserving water during drought. If state and federal agencies and local water districts continue working together to provide water for cities, farms, and the environment, drought survival will be possible in California's future.